Have you heard of the Battle of the Somme, but not sure exactly how it unfolded? So in a new concept for this channel, and with the idea to make complex historical events clear, but without dumbing them down, we'll fly through that infamous First World War campaign, which to many has come to symbolise the tragedy, slaughter and futility of the First World War. But is it exactly as it seems? So by 1916, the Western Front, an enormous trench network stretching 400 odd miles, looked like this. At one end it ran right up to the English Channel and the other to the mountains of Switzerland, with between those 2 points literally millions of men fighting to the death. On one side were the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, who had invaded early in the war, capturing 90% of Belgium and a big chunk of northern France. On the other, the Western Allies, that's to say Britain and her then empire, Belgium, and by far the most important army at that time, the French. Understandably, both the French and Belgians were not happy about having a massive chunk of their land taken, and so they repeatedly attacked to force their enemy out. And that was generally the way it went, Allies attacking, Germans defending, except right here. In early 1916, the Germans had launched a surprise attack at Verdun, the aim being to chew up their armed forces, and though this was a later justification, bleed the French army white. Enter the Somme. It had actually already been agreed by the Allies to attack in this area, along the Somme River in French Picardy, before the Germans attacked Verdun, but with a few changes it still served a purpose. By attacking here in force, the Allies could inflict heavy attritional losses, regain lost territory, and crucially, force the Germans to redeploy their own reserves to that area and away from Verdun, buying valuable breathing space for the French, who were seriously close to collapse. The original plan was for a joint French and British attack, and it still would be, but now Britain and her empire would take the lead. Over about an 18-mile front, they would smash through the German line, drive about 6 miles in this direction towards Bapaume, an important logistics base, and in doing so, force the Germans to weaken their assault at Verdun. That was it. It wasn't meant to win the war, but if successful, to make sure it kept going. The problem was how to do it. In 1914 and 15, over-the-top attacks proved massively deadly, and for good reason. All armies in the Western Front were in a tricky situation. Technology had made a huge leap before the war, but tactics hadn't. Machine guns, barbed wire and artillery had been combined to make no man's land, the area between the trenches, extremely deadly. To put it simply, for a man to get from A to B, he simply had to cross it. And it differed a lot, from 30 yards at the shortest to more than half a mile. But here's the thing, the problem was the same. There were no flanks. For 400 miles there was a continuous line, so no going round the sides. Armoured vehicles didn't exist, artillery wasn't accurate enough to target specific points, tanks had only just been invented, and that left men. Far too often they'd been sent into the attack to be stopped by barbed wire, hammered by machine guns and shattered by high explosive and shrapnel shells from unseen artillery. New stuff had been tried, attacking at night, using gas and smoke, tunnelling, creeping across no man's land, charging in short bursts, but almost everything had failed. But it simply had to be done. The Western Allies had to kick the invaders out, and that meant attacking. So what about the Somme specifically? The attack this time would take place over that 18-mile front, with the British in the north and centre and the French in the south. To make this assault different and protect the men, artillery was the key. By launching the largest bombardment in the history of mankind and shattering the Germans opposite, there was a chance of success. In short, if everybody's dead, there'll be nobody left to shoot at us. On paper, not a bad idea, but in reality very hard to achieve. Let's understand why. The key goes back to the offensive-defensive concept. Once the Germans had settled in on their new territory in 1914, as the defenders, they adopted the mindset of, we're not going anywhere, so let's fortify our positions. A big part of that meant that the old single front line had turned into a massive complex web of trench systems like this one here, overlaid on the exact spot it once occupied. Here we see a well-built front line, 70 yards to its rear is a further support line, and beyond that a reserve line. Each offer mutual support, are protected by loads of barbed wire and machine guns, and they're all very strongly built. And by the way, this is just one set of trench lines. In some parts of the Somme, those defences were up to 7 lines deep. Not visible here, but clearly present, was the key to what unfolded in the opening phase of the battle to come: dugouts. All along their lines, the Germans had dug deep reinforced dugouts and shelters to protect them from mortar and artillery fire, much deeper than the Allies realised. And so, when that bombardment began, a massive one firing over 1.5 million shells in 7 days, though it was one hell of a horrible experience, it didn't actually kill that many Germans. On the surface, the ground was obliterated, but in most places, below ground, the defenders lived. Enter the 1st of July 1916. Quite simply, the most deadly day in the modern history of the British Army. On that day, from Gommecourt in the north to Montauban in the south, the British had left their trenches behind a fairly crude barrage to attack the enemy positions and met disaster. Here in the north, and in most of the centre, astride the Albert-Bapaume road, which roughly divided the battlefield, they had learned to their cost that the enemy was alive and ready. Even in areas where massive mines had been placed to destroy enemy strongpoints before the troops advanced, like this enormous one which was packed with 60,000 pounds of ammo and is today known as the Lochnagar crater, still hadn't gone to plan. Of the 120,000 men who attacked from 7:30 am, 60,000 had become casualties, with over 19,000 killed. That's one man for every 4.4 seconds in a 24-hour period. Brutal. But that infamous first day wasn't all abject failure, and it wasn't all as stupid as it seems. The classic image is men walking into machine gun fire, which was, in truth, rarely the case. Most units tried rushing their enemy by sprinting across no man's land. Others emerged from tunnels or saps which had been dug in secret towards the enemy trenches, whilst those that did walk did so because they were advancing behind a timed protective artillery barrage designed to sweep clear the enemy lines ahead of them. Most failed, though not all. In the centre and southern parts of the battlefield, there was success. These British divisions broke through the 1st and 2nd German lines, and most French attacks, with better artillery and against weaker parts of the line, saw real success, advancing quite some distance. But on the whole, it had been far too costly, and for far too little gain. But with Verdun on the brink of collapse, the battle simply had to go on. So, would the British attack again in exactly the same way? Well, despite popular opinion, no. Literally nobody, generals included, wanted to do that. It would be pointless and a total waste of lives, but the new stuff to try was extremely limited. In some areas the fighting went on, with troops advancing around Mamet, Troneswood and Contalmaison, with some success, but the next major attack went in 2 weeks later just here in an area called the Bazentin Ridge. Their objective was to capture this area of high ground in the German second-line positions and continue the advance towards Bapaume, but to do that, something had to change. Learning from the brutal 1st of July, the attackers knew that they had to achieve surprise and also draw their enemy into the open to have any chance of really destroying them. One tactic used here was to prepare the assault in darkness and launch a much earlier attack following a hurricane bombardment. A short, sharp artillery barrage which gave the enemy less time to prepare and helped maintain the element of surprise. It would on the Somme be accompanied on occasion by a Chinese attack. This was a fake assault, the idea being to employ the boy who cried wolf, but in a World War I style. By stopping the artillery, then showing bayonets above the trenches, shouting and blowing whistles, the attackers would force their opponents out of their dugouts to man their machine guns for an imminent attack. At that moment, instead of attacking, the Allied artillery would open up on the main line, catching their enemy in the open. This could be repeated again and again until eventually the German response was to stay in cover. Only then would the Allies attack. Not a bad idea, and it did have some success, as did the Battle of Bazentin Ridge generally, which took some important high ground and showed that night movement and surprise could be effective. But now the attackers ran into a new problem on the Somme: woods. The entire region was studded with small pieces of woodland and ancient villages, each of which offered a great opportunity for defence. By digging into tree lines and buildings, the Germans could establish strongly fortified positions with good lines of sight across open fields that made attacking them a nightmare. Protected to some extent from artillery and very hard to attack through, they proved serious problems for the Allies. Foremost amongst them were these: Delville and High Woods. Throughout July and into August, the Allies relentlessly bombarded them to soften up the positions before inevitably sending infantry to take them. In Delville Wood, the South African Brigade alone lost 75% of their 3,100 men in a little under a week. But here too, new tactics were tried. This time, the machine gun barrage. By lining up multiple water-cooled machine guns and firing indirectly from more than a mile away, 99,000 rounds were poured into Delville, causing heavy losses to the remaining defenders. Cavalry even made an appearance here at High Wood, using their mobility over good terrain to race up and capture and hold a key point, but as always, with heavy losses. The same pattern of advances continued here in the centre, with the main thrust up the Bopam Road, along which stood the village of Pozières. Attacked by newly arrived Australian troops, but rushed and with poor planning, it had turned into a brutal slugfest, which did leave the village in Aussie hands, or what was left of it, as we can see from this famous image, but again at heavy cost. Frontal attacks here had failed, and the assault that finally won the town had come instead from this direction. But again, the attacks stalled, and for weeks the Australians were stuck in a brutal fight outside the village for this cluster of destroyed buildings called Mouquet Farm. Although the Allies had been learning and evolving throughout the battle, of course the Germans were too. Reinforcing their artillery, deepening their defensive lines, and continuously making slow, methodical withdrawals, they managed to hold the Allies time and time again. But, and it's important, they also needed to bring in new troops to hold the lines, thus weakening their assault at Verdun. By September, a new problem for everyone involved had set in: rain. The early part of the battle had been largely dry, but now rain, combined with artillery churning up the battlefield, slowed everything down. Even in the south, where the French had seen success, things began to grind to a halt. But again, the attack needed to go on. In early September, the effort would switch right here to the fortified villages of Ginchy and Guillemont. Here, the British would again use artillery, followed by infantry assault to force the defenders out. But by now the tactics had developed into much smaller set-piece efforts, true bite-and-hold tactics. By biting off a small chunk of the enemy line and then consolidating or holding it, it was felt that the inevitable German counterattacks, which was their strict policy and very effective, could be defeated. And whilst it was successful, it was always costly. By now though, the weather, horrific casualties and sheer exhaustion was taking its toll, and a true breakthrough, which would really trouble the Germans, seemed a long way off. Something new was needed. Enter the tank. Landships, or later tanks, a caterpillar-tracked vehicle which offered mobile firepower and protection against machine gun fire, was brand new in warfare. Developed to overcome the problems of assaulting across no man's land, the big one being everybody getting killed, the first 49 had been rushed out to the Somme to be used in the next major attack phase at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. This time using artillery, tanks and infantry, the Allies launched an assault from 15th September on these 45 villages in an attempt to outflank the formidable Thiepval spur to the north, and met with success. The shock effect of these slow-moving but heavily armoured steel monsters appearing on the battlefront, along with much improved creeping barrage, saw an advance of some 2.5 kilometres in the heart of the battlefield, and very nearly a true breakthrough. But the Germans eventually recovered, though they were once again forced to bring in more reserves and give up more ground. The tanks themselves had a mixed performance, mechanically unreliable, most broke down, though those that did keep working often did well and showed that a new tactic could achieve success. The problem was the British at Flers used basically all of the tanks they had, and it would be more than a year before they appeared again in large numbers on the battlefield. By late September, literally everybody on the Somme was exhausted, and there's been plenty of argument that the battle should have been stopped there, especially as the weather continued to get worse. But the Germans were suffering too, and Verdun was still in peril, and there was at least some hope of a breakthrough on the Somme. Back in the north, where the assault had been most heavily repulsed in July, the fighting had carried on. This area, the Thiepval Ridge, and particularly this point, the heavily defended Schwaben Redoubt, was the major defensive obstacle. Almost captured on the very opening day, it had remained in German hands since. Now, like almost everywhere, it was a lunar landscape, with water-filled shell holes and rotting bodies adding to the horror. Attacked repeatedly throughout late September and October, it was eventually taken at the point of the bayonet, which did open the door for further attacks. But by who? And that's a big part of the Somme issue. In late October, the German army defending the Somme was exhausted. In fairness, it had performed incredibly well in defence, but now that line was in serious peril, though the Allies too were in trouble. With worn-out gun barrels and worn-out men, it was getting ever harder to realise and sustain a breakthrough, though there were still efforts made. While costly attacks continued along the old Roman road towards Bapaume, here in the north, with the Schwaben redoubt taken, one more big attack was planned for the 13th of November. It would take place either side of the small river Ancre, which flows through this area. From Beaumont-Hamel in the north to Thiepbau in the south, troops of the Royal Naval Division, 39th and 51st Highland Divisions would push through the main and 2nd German defensive lines in that hellish landscape. Launched in a helpful heavy fog which reduced visibility of the defenders, and with improved artillery and the few remaining tanks to take out key strongpoints, the Battle of the Ancre saw quite some success. South of the river, the 39th did well, captured 1,500 yards of destroyed ground and hundreds of prisoners. The Royal Naval Division on the northern bank also did well, advancing right up to the village of Beaucourt. They held their newly won ground, as did the 51st Highlanders, who finally captured the ruins of Beaumont-Hamel, albeit 4 months later than planned. But despite these late successes, the troops were simply too tired and the ground too waterlogged to achieve the longed-for breakthrough, and over the next 5 days, with winter approaching, the Battle of the Somme petered out, with both sides utterly exhausted. So what was the end result of one of the most famous battles of the First World War? In truth, it's difficult to judge. On one hand, the British and French suffered staggering losses of over 500,000 men killed and wounded, never captured Bapaume and didn't achieve a major breakthrough, but did learn a huge amount throughout the 4-month campaign, lessons that would be vital as the war went on. The Germans suffered too. All told, they lost perhaps 600,000 men in the fighting on the Somme, and many of those experienced high-quality troops, losses from which they would never truly recover, leading General Erich Ludendorff to write, "Our losses were very heavy, and on the Somme our men lost confidence in the possibility of victory." But what about the wider picture? There's no doubt that the Somme campaign in 1916 did stretch the German army, who had to fight both here and at Verdun, thus weakening their assault on that vital city. Had it fallen, the result to the French army would have been catastrophic, and the war on the Western Front may well have ended very differently. So perhaps, in a strange way, the costly success of the Battle of the Somme was not that the war ended in 1916, but that it was able to go on. All that apart, for those who were there and those who lost their loved ones in the battle, on all sides, the outcome was of little comfort, and today the Battle of the Somme is rightly remembered by all as a classic example of the brutal tragedy of the First World War. We hope you found that interesting and that it at least a little helped clarify the story of the battle. This type of video is a new concept for us, so drop us a comment, share the video if you liked it, and if you'd like to see more videos just like this, let us know which. Finally, if like us, you find the First World War endlessly fascinating, why not check out Not So Quiet on the Western Front, our dedicated podcast where my co-host Dr. Spencer Jones and I regularly discuss famous actions from across the Western Front. Check it out right here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.